By the beginning of 1943, the sky over North Africa had become an arena of endless hunting. Germany and America fought for control over supply routes, for every convoy, every airfield, every ship in the Mediterranean. The war there was not beautiful, like in the movies. It was hot, dusty, saturated with the smell of oil, smoke, and burnt metal. The Germans controlled a significant part of the region. Their Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters appeared suddenly, like ghosts, and struck accurately. The Americans, until recently distant from the European war, now lived in the sky every day, and every mission could be their last. The main weapon of the USA in this battle was the Flying Fortress, the heavy bomber B-17. These machines were not just airplanes. They were a symbol of American industry and engineering. Durable, reliable, built to return home even when everything around was falling apart. They were called fortresses for a reason. Multi-layered armor, 10 gun positions, 4 engines, and the ability to stay in the air even if one of them was destroyed. One such aircraft stood on the runway of the Biskra Air Base in Algeria. A young crew, new faces, fresh paint on the fuselage. On the fuselage, in white letters, was written the name All American. The aircraft commander was Lieutenant Bruce Caron, a 23-year-old pilot from Texas. Calm, confident, a man who rarely spoke loudly but always acted clearly. His co-pilot was Al Andrews. The flight engineer was Sam McGee. The radio operator was Robert Townsend. The gunners were guys from different states, from Kansas to California. None of them were heroes, just a crew doing their job. On February 17, 1943, their mission seemed routine. A strike on a German convoy off the coast of Tunisia. Nothing unusual. Take off, proceed to the target, drop bombs, return. They had already had dozens of such assignments. But war dislikes predictability. The morning was clear, the sun was high, visibility excellent. This always made pilots wary. The better the visibility, the easier it was to be shot down. The squadron formed up in a wedge and headed southeast. The cockpit was hot. The instruments trembled from the vibration of the engines, and outside the window the endless desert began. At an altitude of 7,000 meters, the landscape seemed peaceful, almost beautiful, but each of them knew, in a few minutes, the sky would change. When they reached the target, the German column was already moving along the coast. The commander gave the signal. The bombs hit accurately. Flashes erupted below. Black clouds of smoke began to rise. Everything went according to plan. But as soon as the group turned onto the return course, the radio operator heard an alarming cry over the radio. "My God, 6 o'clock high, coming fast." Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters emerged from the clouds, fast, sharp, as if carved from a single steel plate. They came from the direction of the sun to blind the gunners. The first bursts missed, then hits started coming from all sides. The air filled with tracers, sparks, and the roar of the turrets. The crew of the All-American acted in unison. The gunners returned fire. The pilots held formation. The radio operator shouted coordinates. Chaos began in the sky. One B-17 caught fire and went down. Another lost an engine. A third fell out of formation. The All-American was still holding on, but the hits were getting closer. Suddenly something flashed to the right. A German fighter came in head-on but didn't have time to pull away. Its wing grazed the tail of the fortress. The impact was so strong that the fuselage of the All-American literally cracked in half. Everything in the cockpit shook. Instruments flew to the floor. A metallic screech pierced everything inside. Lieutenant Caron didn't immediately understand what had happened. The plane didn't completely disintegrate, but the rear section was hanging by shreds of metal, the stabilizer flapping like a rag. A blast of air hit the nose. The rear section was gaping open. the sky visible through the hole. The gunner sitting in the tail died instantly. The others froze. Someone shouted, "That's it! We've lost the tail!" But Karen replied calmly, "If it's holding, we're flying." They were 200 kilometers from the coast, almost an hour's flight to the base, and the machine was falling apart before their eyes. On every turn, the tail swung from side to side like a pendulum. The flight engineer tried to reinforce the joints with cables. The radio operator fastened panels with wires. The others just held onto the handrails, feeling the metal tremble beneath their feet. At any moment, it could all end. The crew didn't know that below, the Germans, observing from their positions, had already reported to headquarters. Target shot down. Aircraft disintegrated in midair. They were sure the All-American had crashed into the sea. No one could imagine that an hour later this plane would still be in the sky. The air inside the plane became icy. Cold rushed through the hole in the fuselage, as if the altitude itself was trying to pull the men out. In the rear section, the wind whistled, tearing at wires and pieces of skin. Every few seconds, the fuselage shuddered. The tail, held on by a miracle, swayed by centimeters, then by tens of centimeters, then leveled out again. No one understood how much longer it would hold. The cockpit was quiet, too quiet for war. Only the vibration of the engines and Karen's short commands, which sounded as if he was talking not to people but to the machine itself. He held the yoke with both hands, feeling the elevator tremble, as if the plane was resisting. In such moments he understood that his task was no longer to win, he just had to get everyone home. A second's mistake, and the entire tail section could tear off, taking half the crew with it. The radio operator Townsend tried to contact the base, but the antenna was damaged. Instead of a signal, only static. He switched frequencies, shouted into the microphone, changed settings. Finally, he managed to catch a weak channel. "This is All-American. We are damaged. Holding on." His voice trembled, but every word went out over the air. The response didn't come immediately, but they heard it. "Roger. Try to keep it going. We are waiting for you." They flew low to avoid turbulence. Below stretched the endless desert, hot and silent. At times it seemed to be moving, like a sea. Sand waves under the wings created an illusion of sailing, and every gust of wind felt like a blow. The sun was setting and the light became dim, orange, bloody. In this light, everything looked even more unreal. The flight engineer McGee crawled along the fuselage, trying to reinforce what could still. With every kilometer, it got worse. The air in the cockpit grew thinner, the engines began to lose power. One of them stalled, then a second coughed and switched to an uneven mode. Karen didn't say a word. He just smoothly adjusted the controls, keeping the plane from banking. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. He wasn't thinking. He just felt the machine, as if they had become one body. When they approached the coast, the sun had already dropped below the horizon. The sky turned gray, the desert black, and the line of the sea looked like a thin boundary between death and salvation. The radio came to life again. "All-American, we see you on radar. You are close. Hold on." These words sounded unreal. Everyone understood that holding on meant just not falling apart. Suddenly, a grinding sound was heard. The metal, somewhere in the tail, gave way. The sound traveled through the fuselage like a blow to the nerves. The engineer shouted that the cables were starting to snap. They saw the rear section literally separating, millimeter by millimeter. The air tore out pieces of skin, exposing the internal spars. Karen understood. If he made one sharp move, it was all over. He reduced engine power to lessen the vibration and guided the plane softly, as if leading a child by the hand. The crew almost stopped breathing. The sky was visible inside the cabin, right through the hole in the fuselage. Somewhere in the distance, over the sea, the lights of the airfield appeared, small, trembling, as if painted right onto the darkness. Those lights seemed like the last landmark in a world that was collapsing. "Land it," said Andrews. Karen didn't answer. He just lowered the nose and began the descent. The air hummed, the tail vibrated, everything inside creaked and shook. They didn't know if the plane would withstand touchdown. At a height of 100 meters, the tail began to shift apart. The engineer screamed, but Karen didn't listen. He was already inside the process, as if the whole world had narrowed to the line of the runway. The landing was not a flight, but a fall, but it happened. The plane touched the ground, swayed, and at that moment the tail finally tore off. It went backward, flipped over, and stopped a few dozen meters away. The All-American rolled a little further, its landing gear screeching, and stopped. Silence hit their ears louder than the roar of the engines. No one moved, only steam from the engines and a faint trembling of the fuselage. Then someone shouted, "We're alive!" And as if all the fatigue, all the fear, all the tension of the last hours poured out into that cry. People began to laugh, hug, some cried, some just sat staring into emptiness. When the engineers and mechanics ran up to the plane, they froze. No one could believe that this had even flown. The rear section was held on by literally 3 metal sheets and shreds of cables. Through the holes, the sunset was visible. In the photographs taken later, the fuselage looked like a broken toy, and against the background of that toy stood the living, tired faces. Pilots who weren't supposed to return, but did. Karen was the last to exit. He just looked at the plane, exhaled, and said quietly, "She made it." The morning at the airbase began with silence. People walked between the hangars as if afraid to disturb the air. The All-American stood aside, tilted on one wing, as if the machine itself was trying to catch its breath. At first glance, no one believed that this plane could even have gotten airborne. The fuselage was torn almost in half. The tail was held by tatters of skin. Inside, a void where the gun positions used to be. Through the gashes, the sky was visible, and when the wind blew, the fuselage shifted almost imperceptibly, as if breathing. Engineers and technicians stood around in silence. Some just held their heads. One senior mechanic whispered, "If I hadn't seen it land, I..." Lieutenant Karen, the crew commander, stood nearby. He didn't look like a hero, just a tired man whose eyes reflected the same plane that had saved his life. Reporters tried to talk to him, but he answered briefly, calmly. "She did it all herself," he said. "We just helped her make it." These words were later repeated in all the newspapers. When the photographs of the All-American were first printed, the world didn't believe it. Newspapers in London, New York, Washington published the pictures with captions, "The plane that wasn't supposed to return." In the black and white photos, the fuselage looked like a torn piece of cloth through which the horizon was visible. People examined them and asked, "How is this even possible?" The American Army used these photos for reports and lectures on the structural strength of the B-17. But more importantly, they showed not engineering, but spirit. The photo of the crew standing in front of the half-destroyed fortress became a symbol of perseverance. It was sent to the fronts, hung in mess halls, pinned on the walls of headquarters. At the bottom, they often wrote a short phrase, "She came back." Meanwhile, the story reached Germany as well. Through intelligence and propaganda services, the Germans obtained photographs of the All-American. The reaction was mixed. Some said it was a fake, others said it was a montage. But among the Luftwaffe pilots, a rumor started that American planes don't die. One German pilot said in a post-war interview, "We saw a B-17 fall, and a week later we learned it had returned. We started shooting not at people, but at a myth." For the Germans, this was almost an insult. They took pride in their engineering, precision, metal, discipline. And now they had to admit that somewhere across the ocean, they had made something different. Not more beautiful, not more elegant, but tougher. The All-American became for them not just a story, but a reminder that the enemy could be not only strong, but also stubborn. Meanwhile, life went on at the American base. The plane no longer flew. The engineers decided to leave it as a monument. But the crew wasn't disbanded. A week later, Karen and his men received a new B-17 and continued their flights. When asked what it was like to go back up into the sky after such an experience, the photos of the All-American reached Washington. In one report, General Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, wrote a short note. "This is not just a plane. This is America." That phrase said it all. Because the story of the All-American was not about metal, not about war, and not even about survival. It was about what makes Americans American. The belief that as long as the machine holds on, you hold on too. And the Germans were still arguing. Was it a fluke or some new type of aircraft? But the answer was simple. Neither. It was simply a man who didn't let go of the yoke. Months passed, then years, but the name All-American didn't disappear. It began to sound not as an aircraft's call sign, but as a reminder. Its photographs hung on the walls in barracks, in headquarters, and even in cadet schools. Young pilots looked at them before their first flight and understood that there was nothing beautiful in this story, only dirt, fear, and stubbornness. But that's what made it real. There was no triumph there, there was endurance. And everyone who sat in the cockpit knew, somewhere in the sands of North Africa, one machine had shown that the limit exists only in the mind. When the war was coming to an end, the flying fortresses were spoken of with respect, almost reverence. They were considered the machines that saved Europe. But in this endless sea of serial numbers, modifications, and reports, the All-American stood out. It became a symbol that war is not about technology, but about people who refuse to die. The story of the plane torn apart in midair spread to all fronts, and even where it was heard in passing, it sounded the same. The Americans don't fall. When the German archives were opened after the surrender, Luftwaffe officers found old reports with notes about ghost planes. Among them was a message from February 1943, short, dry, without emotion. B-17 destroyed, crashed into the sea. Now it looked like a mockery of fate. The Luftwaffe no longer existed, but the one they had destroyed had become a legend. In this was not just defeat. It was the irony of history. German precision had lost to human stubbornness. By the time of Germany's surrender, after the war, he returned home to Texas. He worked as an instructor, training young pilots. On his desk stood a black and white photograph of the All-American, the very one where the plane is on the runway, surrounded by holes and shreds of metal. Every cadet saw it, and when someone asked why it was there, Karen answered, "So you remember, it's not about how to take off, it's about how to come back." Over time, that photograph became iconic. It was printed on posters, in magazines, in textbooks. For engineers, it was an example of structural strength. For the military, a symbol of courage. For ordinary people, proof that even in hell, you can make it to the end if you don't let go. When documentary films about World War II began to be made in the U.S. in the 50s, the story of the All-American was told in every one of them. The newsreel showed that very fuselage, pierced through, and the people standing next to it. No one added music, no one read pompous texts. Everything was said by the image itself, the shattered plane and the living faces. That was enough. The Germans who survived the war sometimes wrote letters to their American counterparts. In one of them, a former Luftwaffe pilot who had fought over Tunisia admitted, "I shot at your fortresses and thought they were doomed. When I saw the photo of the All-American, I understood that we were fighting against something that couldn't be destroyed. Over time, the All-American ceased to be just a story. It became part of American identity. This legend taught not pride, but responsibility. Because being strong doesn't mean not being afraid. Being strong means pulling until you fall apart, and even then continuing, if there's even one chance left. The plane remained on the ground. It wasn't restored, no attempt was made to return it to service. Its fuselage, riddled by time, stood under a canopy at the base for many long years. People approached, touched the metal, looked inside and saw not ruins, but strength. When a veteran, a former gunner from that crew, visited there 20 years later, he ran his hand along the side and said, "She didn't fall. She just got tired." Stories like this don't age. They don't need embellishment because they are incredible enough as they are. The All-American remained